Okay, so what if we wanted to make things a little more interesting by putting a button on the opposite side of the room that's going to open our door? So it's not a matter of walking up to our door and pressing E. And what we need to do is we need to go to an object on the other side of the room and press E there in order to open the door. Fortunately, we've already learned how to do most of this. So to see this in action, I'm going to grab one of the art pieces out of the Edith Finch level, and I'm going to search through my content to find it. There's an interesting little garden gnome. So if I search for gnome, there's gnome A, and I'm going to bring this gnome out into my level. So this gnome is now going to be the object that I'm going to have to interact with in order to open my door. So we're going to use the same tools and techniques that we used to make this door trigger, but we're going to add some features to it to make it a little bit more interesting. So to do this, I'm going to get rid of the key press trigger that I currently have over my door. I'm going to get rid of that text render actor that currently is my door text, right? And I'm going to add a new trigger that's going to become a new object inside of the game world. So I'm going to quickly add a trigger box. And I'm just going to move that object. So it's here over my gnome. This is going to require my player to be within range of this garden gnome in order to interact with it. So I'm going to need to do some size changes. And we're going to take our gnome, and right now, as before, Unreal only knows it as a static mesh actor. But we're going to make this be the button that opens up our door. So I'm going to create a new blueprint for it. It's going to be a child again of static mesh actor. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call mine BP remote button. I'm going to load mine into my blueprints folder. Click select. And now we're going to think about what events and what things we need to do for this button to work, right? So in order for my gnome here to run, it's not going to do anything. It's not when I collide with it. I don't need a tick. I don't need a begin play. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my own custom events. Let's do one for activating the button. And we'll do another custom event for deactivating the button. When we activate this button, we're going to have something happen to this gnome, and I don't want it to happen instantaneously. I don't want it to happen right away. I'm going to have it happen over time. So in order for it to happen over time, I'm going to need a timeline. So I'm adding a timeline here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that. Instead of my gnome kind of opening and closing the way that we did a rotation of the door, we'll take a look real quick at how we can actually add to the current rotation. I'm going to add a timeline. I'm going to add a track here. Once again, it's a float, and this is going to be my rotation amount. I'm going to set up my time for how long it takes to rotate. I'm going to do it in half a second. At the start, right, I can set up a key at 0 that starts at 0. And then I can add a key to the end at my half second timeline. That now, since I'm not doing percentage, I can actually type in a value. So I'm going to make this at 20 degrees. So I'm going to set it to 20. Now that I have my timeline that will start at 0 and go up to 20 at the end of my time, I can go back to my object, and our rotation amount can then be used to change our object. So we're going to set actor relative rotation. And we're going to do this every time our timeline updates. And we don't want to rotate the entire rotator. So once again, I'm going to split that struct. And we're just going to have it pitch. So I'm going to have it lean backwards. So I'm going to take my rotation amount and I'm going to change that Y so it kind of looks up and down or leans backwards. And this is going to allow me that when my timeline plays, it's going to rotate my little gnome. So it's going to look like I'm kind of pulling on him or moving him or tilting him backwards. When I want to deactivate this, right, we're going to reverse that timeline and go back in the other direction. However, what we want to do is when we're finished with this timeline, When it reaches the end and stops, we're going to then send the command to open the door. So I'm going to add a variable for what door I'm going to open. Remember, if there's no door variable, we're not going to be able to change it. So I'm going to set the type to be BP underscore door. Let's delete. All right, so we're going to need to add a variable for the door that we're going to use. So I'm going to call it door, and the type is going to be BP underscore door. We're going to need it exposed so that we can connect it inside of the details. And now I'm going to be able to get that door. And we'll be able to call the open door event. And we can run this event when our timeline is finished. However, our timeline will finish no matter which direction we're going. If we're moving forward and get to the end, or if we're moving backward and get to the end. And so this is going to set it up so that even when we deactivate, it's going to open the door. So what I'm going to do instead is that we're going to look at this direction node that comes out of here. This direction node is what's called an enum. An enum is a way to refer to a value with a name that only us scripters and designers can see. The player will never see this name, but it allows us to make a switch based on the value that comes out of here. So a switch is going to be very similar to a branch, except it's going to be based on what's called an enum value. Right now, we're going to focus just on using the enums that Unreal has built for us, but later we'll be able to switch based on enums that we create ourselves. So here's our direction. I'm going to switch based on this E timeline direction. What this means is that we're now going to have this option of making two different decisions based on what value this direction is set. So as we come out of the finished, we're going to make a choice based on what direction the timeline was moving in. If the timeline was moving forward, we're going to open the door. If the timeline was moving backwards, we're going to close the door. So this way we can think about doing different things based on the value of a given variable. So we looked at how to do that branching when it's a Boolean, and now we know how to do it with a switch whenever it's one of these enums or enumerators. Excellent. So now we've got our graph here that represents our button object. And what our button object is going to do is it's going to play this timeline. When this timeline finishes, it's going to switch based on which direction it was going. If it was going forward, it's going to open the door. If it was going backward, it's going to close the door. And then every frame of that timeline, while it's running, we're going to set the relative rotation of our actor. So we're going to rotate it based on where we're at. So let's save, compile, and take a look at how we can add a trigger that's going to work for this situation. So there's my object. My gnome itself is the remote button. Here's my trigger box that's set up. My trigger box needs to be an object that interacts with a remote button. So I'm going to add that there. We're going to select, and I'm going to call it BP, remote button trigger. I know it's the trigger that works with these remote buttons. So in my viewport, we're going to see that it's just the trigger. Under the event graph, we're going to create the actions that occur for this object. So to begin overlap, when we enter this object, this is where we're going to enable input. And we're going to enable input for our first player. When we end overlap, we're going to disable input. And once again, for our player. Now you may want to add the code in here so that only the player object works in this situation. We've seen how to do that in previous lessons, but we're not going to take the time to do it here because we're moving quickly. All right, once we get this idea that we're reading input when it overlaps, we're going to add another event. So event key and we're looking for the E key. So now when they press the E key when they're in there, we're going to run an action. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell our remote button to activate, right? So we're going to create a variable. This variable is our remote button that we work with here. We're going to set the type, BP, remote button. And we're going to get that object. And we're going to use our activate event that we created. We're also going to want to be able to deactivate the remote button. So coming off of there, I'm going to have an object to deactivate. Only we want this to work back and forth every time they press the E key. So back and forth, we're going to flip-flop. And the flip-flop's going to say the first time we press it, we're going to activate. The second time we press it, we're going to deactivate. All right, if we compile and save, we should have an operating trigger here ready for us to go. So now that I'm back in Unreal, I'm going to need to make sure that everything is hooked up correctly the way that we want them to be. So I'm going to select my remote button trigger, and I'm going to set the button that it's going to activate. I'm going to select my remote button. I'm going to make sure that my little gnome is movable, and I'm going to set under default the door that he's going to open. And so now my trigger will activate my gnome. When it finishes animating, it'll activate the door. And so if I save and run this level, I should be able to go over to my gnome, press E,
Open sesame,
and the door opens. I press the other way, he goes back, and the door ends.
Open
So I've got this
sesame,
idea where we're able to set this rotation to
Open
rotate our gnome
sesame,
and change the door. Now it's a little strange that we may not want him side to side if you want him forward to backward. You just need to change which rotation you're
Open
using.
sesame,
I chose to use the one that would kind of turn him sideways, but you can
Open
choose to set it to
sesame,
another value. And so now we've got this little gnome that we can activate.
Open sesame,